Great to see you back here after lunch. Hey, great to have you here. So we are here after lunch when you are fresh and with all the energy to talk about serious things. We have prepared discussion about intelligence. When I was in service many years ago, intelligence was the business of military organizations and other organizations that this is really was quite close to their mission. Today, we understand that in cybersecurity, intelligence is very important also to organizations that in the past were not even connected to these topics. Banks, retail, other companies are all looking to know more about the intelligence of cybersecurity. They all need intelligence in order to better defend themselves. We know, of course, that cybersecurity is relevant still to intelligence between countries as part of cyber warfare, but we are talking here mainly today about the intelligence that help us to better protect our organizations or to expose crimes or to find things that are important in order to better run our businesses, our life, and things like this. We've prepared here 3 very interesting topics, a bit different, one way from the other. The first one is going to be to hear like a case, a real case of a crime that was in a very dedicated and what we call dark investigation, found very interesting things that you will hear in a minute. Later on, we're going to hear about intelligence and threats in the global arena and in 2 examples of relevant geographies that are in the global interest today. So without waiting any extra second, we are going to start, and our first 2 speakers together will present a case that I've just mentioned, and this is my pleasure to invite the 2 guys from Dark Money Files, the director, Barrow, and the other director, Ray Blake, both from the Dark Money Files. Let's hear a relevant case about intelligence and investigation. Please.
Thank you very much. Well, hello.
Hello.
We're delighted to be here to talk about this very important story and the investigation that we conducted in this area. We make a podcast called The Dark Money Files, which is about the kind of things that name implies, I think. We don't see many darker affairs than the incident and the people behind it that we're going to be talking about today. Where does it start, Graham?
It starts actually in 2013.
Going the wrong way.
Ray. There was a merchant ship called the MV Rosas, which loaded itself up with some ammonium nitrate, about 2,750 tons.
Roughly.
And it went on a journey. It started actually out, as you can see, in Batumi. Mm-hmm. And it was supposed to be going to Mozambique, but it didn't get there, did it?
No, absolutely, it didn't get there. It stopped in Beirut. Now, the captain was a Russian. His mate, incidentally, was Ukrainian. There they are together in happier times between their 2 countries. The boat was flagged from Moldova, which is quite a trick, really.
No sea in
No
Moldova.
sea at all in Moldova. But it was owned by a Panamanian company, which I think kind of makes a certain amount of sense. After docking, the ship was declared unseaworthy and was held in port. The cargo was brought on shore a year later. So what do we know about the intervening year, Graham?
It was pretty tough for the crew on board. They weren't allowed to leave the ship. They were struggling. They weren't being paid. They started selling off the diesel from the ship in order to raise money to feed themselves. It was pretty grim, and eventually most of them managed to get out and get home, and the ammonium nitrate was moved to a warehouse on the dock.
Yeah, it was moved to a warehouse on the dock, and it started to leak, and it was considered unstable. In one sentence there, two phrases that you really don't want to hear. In August 2020, as you may have seen on the television news, following a fire, it blew up in quite devastating fashion. How devastating? Very devastating. It was estimated to be the equivalent of 1/10 of a nuclear bomb, which I think is big by anyone's reckoning. The explosion was felt as far away as Turkey, here in Israel, in Syria, and parts of Europe as well. The blast was heard in Cyprus, 150 miles, 240 kilometers away. This was a huge blast, alleged to have been one of the biggest man-made explosions ever recorded outside of atomic weapon testing. Ouch.
And probably in most years it would have dominated the news cycle much more than it did, but of course it wasn't most years, it was 2020 and we were in the grips of the first waves of the coronavirus. So there's a story to tell here which wasn't really reported, and that's the story we want to tell. But we're going to start off just by reminding you just how devastating this explosion was, just to give a bit of context to what we want to talk about.
Okay, so here's the docks in Beirut just before the explosion. You can see Warehouse 12 on that little jutty out bit. You may not know which building is Warehouse 12, but when we show you the after picture, it should become obvious. There's the after picture, and you can see very clearly there the scale of the damage. Let me show you that in some numbers. And behind all of those numbers are countless human stories of ongoing misery, because this is not a part of the local geography. This is not a society that's in any position really to build back in any coherent way at that stage from a blast.
And like the figure that still gets me is 300,000 people were homeless.
Yeah, outrageous, isn't it?
So what's the story?
Well, according to reports, and here's a copy of the contract that we dug up, the ammonium nitrate was being shipped on behalf of a UK company called Savaro Limited, who had bought the ammonium nitrate from a Russian company called, and you're going to do this, Graham, because you're good with the pronunciations.
Rustavi Azot?
Oh, very good, LLC. Savaro Limited has a very intriguing history. We traced it back to an incorporation in June 2006 with a registered address in London's Tottenham Court Road, which will be familiar to you if you've ever seen a London tube map. It's pretty much front and centre of London's underground. And its control traces through a network of companies in the UK and Cyprus. And as we investigated this network, we became aware of a fairly mysterious woman called Marina Silu, who seems to have been behind all of it. Let's talk about her reach. First of all, the company Savaro Limited, which supplied the ammonium nitrate. She's the director. She's also the person with significant control, a formal position in the company, which basically means she calls the shots, right, Graham?
Yep.
And she had similar roles in these other companies, UK and Cypriot, that sat in the ownership chain of the company that supplied the ammonium nitrate that later exploded. And overall, she's quite a busy person, isn't she?
Well,
Graham,
she is.
Do you want to talk about her
She's
reach?
director of 157 companies in her westernised name, but also a further 86 in the Greek script. And that's an interesting thing about the internet and cyber now, is that you need to be multidisciplinary in your approach to these sorts of investigations, because so much of the internet is now in very different scripts. Obviously here in Israel that's true, it's true in Russia and in other places that use Cyrillic and in Greek. So the ability to interrogate the internet through different scripts, incredibly important part of our work in open source investigations.
Absolutely.
So I think we can say that she probably wasn't a director in any sense that we would understand.
Well, to us, this looked like she was acting in an administrative or a proxy function on behalf of other actors who stayed behind the scenes. And there, many people would have left it, and that's what the networks rely on, of course. But in the UK, we are blessed with an open, public, free-to-access corporate registry that we can go and search, and any of you can as well. It's maintained in Wales, hence the Welsh language on the sign, but it's fully searchable online for free from anywhere in the world. So we went and researched there, and we said, well, look, based on what we can find out about Savaro, can we find other companies that have similar fact patterns where we might be able to find some of the people behind them and tie this whole thing together? So we start off with Savaro Limited, the supplier, remember, of the ammonium nitrate. And what we can see happening with Savaro is that it starts off at that property we spoke about in Tottenham Court Road in June 2006. It moves west to Great Russell Street in June 2008. Then it moves back east again to 13 John Princes Street in June 2011. And then finally, it pitches up in Cotton's Gardens in East London in May 2018. Cotton's Gardens sounds lovely, doesn't it? Yeah. There's Cotton's Gardens. Now, we've found two other ostensibly unrelated companies which share quite similar fact patterns, quite similar movements as well. And to bring it all together, Marina Silu is connected with each of those companies. Let's see.
Yeah, sorry, Ray. I'll just say these are.
Let's see how.
Well, away we go. So these companies have directors, they have company secretaries, they have PSCs, but they're owners. You'll see that they have rather fluid spellings. Their names appear in very different spellings, but that's mainly because they were Arabic. But what we find is that Marina Silu was signing paperwork on behalf of all three of these companies. So the one that owned the ammonium nitrate and these other two companies.
Yep, absolutely. And we've got the same people behind Alpha Procurement, which shared very, very similar moves of headquarters to the other two companies. And Marina Silu, this shadowy figure behind all of them, which raises the question, why are these people interesting, and why were we interested to find these people presumably behind companies that were very closely linked to that explosion in Beirut? Well, one word, really.
Yes, they were sanctioned. So they were sanctioned by the Office of Financial Assets Control, OFAC, in the US. They were sanctioned at various different times.
Yeah.
And let's talk about those sanctions, Ray.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mr. Hazwani, spelled variously across different systems, has Syrian, Russian, dual nationality, sanctioned by OFAC in 2015, in November of 2015, along with HESCO, one of the two companies that we saw. And the reason for that sanction was acting as a middleman between the Syrian government and ISIS through the company, HESCO, which was operating energy production facilities in ISIS-controlled areas. So these are the ideal people to be supplying large quantities of ammonium nitrate, surely.
Well, yeah. Mr. Abras, of course, was Mr. Hazwani's son-in-law and was responsible for running the Moscow office of HESCO Engineering. And he was sanctioned the following year in 2016.
Absolutely. So the people behind all of these companies are already sanctioned, but it goes further than that. An associate of Mr. Hazwani, George Hazwani, is a chap called Moudal al-Khoury, who in late 2013 was alleged to have been an intermediary in the attempted procurement of ammonium nitrate from a Russian company, which sounds very familiar because that is exactly the kind of transaction that started this whole trail for us. Now, I think we'll leave that one there.
Well, yeah, I think, yes, I was just going to say it is really worth knowing that The reason that we were able to do this investigation, and clearly there's a lot more to it, but the really important reason is that in the UK, we have free, unfettered access to company information. And without that unfettered access that allowed us to tie together these three companies, and to be clear, we are not alleging that Savaro was in any way involved in...
Perish
that would be wrong. But the ability to interrogate that data is so important to be able to draw out from a story which hitherto hasn't gained any traction, that explosion, terrible as it was, has a deeper story behind it.
Absolutely. So that's not where we left our investigation, but that is where we're going to leave you today. If you want to know more about this and other similar stories of international financial shenanigans,
we like shenanigans,
then join us and listen to the Dark Matter.
And there is a specific podcast episode about that story which goes into a great deal more detail, should you be interested in following it up.
But thank you so much for your time and attention today, and please enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bram and Ray, before you leave the stage, stay with us for a minute. First, it was a fascinating story and amazing, and I got few questions from the audience during the event. The first one, people here ask if all this very deep investigation, you run this as a company or as a part of organization. Can you say a word about this?
Well, we ought to actually give a shout out. We were actually invited by a Lebanese documentary maker called Firas Hatoum, who did the main investigation. So we help and support journalists and documentary makers to understand the technical elements of these companies, shell companies, as part of their investigation.
And we consult to law enforcement in the UK and elsewhere as well.
Amazing. And maybe another thing for the audience here, we are here in the Cyber Week, and when many of us concerned of how we can better run our companies, how we can better protect our assets and things like this. Do you have any, based on the cases that you run, do you have any recommendation for our audience here and at home?
Identities is the thing, really. We've heard a lot about identities today. You will learn an awful lot by looking behind what might be a superficial identity of somebody that you are dealing with, or someone who is purporting to be your friend, your customer, your supplier, whoever. Dig deeper. Know your counterparty, know your customer, know your supplier, know them as well as they know themselves, because otherwise there's an opportunity they can exploit.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, so we are about to hear our next speaker that is going to come here from CrowdStrike and to share with us the threat globally and also specifically threats that are relevant here to Israel and to our region. So we're really excited to have here Adam Meyers, the head of intelligence of CrowdStrike. Please, Adam.
Thanks. Is there like a clicker or something? Oh, there we go. Shalom. Thank you for your time. 13 minutes is probably the least amount of time I've ever presented in. I'm from New York. I'm going to go real fast. So this is me, Adam Meyers. I've been with CrowdStrike since we launched the company, 11 years. It's been fun. I'll move on. When we launched CrowdStrike, the belief we had was that we needed to build a security platform that was adversary focused, that no matter what business you're in, what location you're in, that there's threat actors that are humans that are trying to steal information or do something bad. And if you understand who they are, you know where they're located, then you can better defend your enterprise, better defend your business. Threat actors, as we see it, fit into three categories. The first being nation state. They conduct espionage, sabotage, disruptive, destructive operations. And in the case of North Korea, also financial attacks to steal money, cryptocurrency. Criminal actors, coin operated, very largely over the past several years. This has been defined by ransomware. Today, we're seeing a shift away from ransomware to data extortion. These threat actors have figured out that they can make more money faster by stealing data and leaking it if you don't pay them than by doing encryption and all of this. And so we're seeing this shift occur before our very eyes right now. And then finally, hacktivist, which is really a catch-all for hacktivist, activist, nationalist, terrorist. Typically, they conduct disruptive operations. From a CrowdStrike point of view, we track over 185 threat actors across the globe. And we've come up with a clever naming system for this. We think it's clever. So for criminals, we call them Spider. For China, we call that Panda. For Iran, we call that Kitten. North Korea is Cholima. I don't have time to go through it all, but Cholima is a magical flying animal, which is the official animal of North Korea, which was just the kind of crazy we were hoping for. And I'll just kind of move on, but you can see there's many nations. We see more and more each year. Recently, we've started tracking threat actors out of Turkey, targeting telecoms. We've associated that with the agencies there. We've also been observing actors coming out of Syria, which we track as Hawk, and also Colombia, which we track as Ocelot. That's a lot of threat actors to try to protect against. Protect your business, protect your enterprise. And the good news is that you don't have to protect against all of those threat actors at one time. These actors have capabilities, things that they can do, and intentions, things that they want to do. And so from an Israel perspective, you could see that we kind of see where these threats are in terms of capabilities and intentions. There's four that really are a big concern, I think. If I am operating in Israel, these are the four I would probably start with. You can't protect against every threat all at once, so start with the ones that are most likely to target you. So from that 185 threat actors, we can actually whittle that down to some that are of particular significance here in Israel. There's criminal actors that are conducting, in this case, a lot of ransomware-related activity. Iran, obviously a regional problem here, and quite a few threat actors associated with Iran. North Korea, because of the high tech here in Israel, particularly with things like cryptocurrency and DeFi and DAOs and things of that nature, these threat actors are very much interested in stealing cryptocurrency, targeting blockchain technology, and also they conduct economic espionage. There's a number of programs that are in place in North Korea to better improve their energy, their digital agriculture, and a variety of other sectors, and they're trying to steal that technology so that they can bring it to their own market. Activist groups as well, and of course China. Now I think that China, there's probably more Chinese threat actors than what we've seen targeting Israel, and this is going to be a continued problem. As I look across Tel Aviv and I see the Chinese companies building the metro here, building the port, there's real concern with espionage from Chinese actors. The Belt and Road Initiative, and which Israel I think is a part of, is part of their broader strategy, and that comes with espionage, that comes with theft of intellectual property, that comes with joint ventures and things that you all need to be looking at and thinking about. One of the things that I wanted to focus on, though, in Israel is something that we've increasingly been seeing, which is disruptive operations. Since 2020, we've seen Iranian actors employing ransomware with no authentic financial motive. They're deploying ransomware to disrupt businesses and to steal information and to leak it. And we call this at CrowdStrike lock and leak operations. And there's a number of threat actors, which I'll go into in a second, that do this. And we believe that this is a cover for a disruptive attack, what we would say is a computer network attack in the US DoD lexicon. The 5 actors, looks like we had a little formatting issue there, but the 5 actors that are engaged in this, you could see Haywire Kitten has been active since 2020, and they're conducting lock and leak operations. Pioneer Kitten is another that engages in this. You may have heard about Pay to Key or Networm. Spectral Kitten, which is known as Apostle, and also Black Shadow. They've been, and they also rebranded, so they're constantly changing the name to make it more difficult to track them. Nemesis Kitten has targeted not just Israel, but also in North America. We've seen them operating. And then I'm sure everybody has been following the news in the last couple of weeks. We track it as Splintered Envoy. This is a activity cluster that we track. And I'll come to this with an interesting video in a moment, but this is known as Moses Staff. They turned on the sirens here in Israel about a week ago and are continuing to operate and disrupt operations and disrupt life here in Israel. Typical lock and leak operation, this is all hypothetical, obviously, but you'll see that the initial they spent about a month for the intrusion. They start to do the data exfil. Once they've gotten the data that they're looking to leak, then they go into the lock operation where they'll actually encrypt things and make life difficult for the victim. And in this case, the victim now thinks they're engaged in a ransomware incident, and they're going to try to do the incident response and look at negotiation. Do we negotiate? Do we pay? Do we not pay? They don't care. They don't want the money. What they want to do now is start to leak the information. And so while the organization is busy thinking about how to solve the problem, you have them leaking this information with the goal of what I would say is psychological warfare. So Splintered Envoy is very similar, and our friends from Microsoft are going to be talking about this in a little bit, the activity in Ukraine. But Voodoo Bear has been targeting Ukraine since 2014, since the annexation of Crimea, and they've been running these operations to try to erode public trust in the Ukrainian government, to scare the people of Ukraine to thinking that bad things are going to happen over 6-7 years of time. And this is very much what we're seeing Splintered Envoy doing with Moses Staff. We've also seen it being used as a cover for action or a distraction, which is similar to how Stardust Chalima has been using wipers as a diversion from other operations. Pioneer Kitten as well, so in terms of harassment and embarrassment, and then also degrading responses. They want to burn down your incident response time. Incident responders have limited resources, limited time, and the more that you make them work, the more prone they are to make mistakes, and this is what they're capitalizing on. They want to grind down the response and the readiness of the cyber defenders. I'm actually gonna, so this was a Moses Staff video from the recent leaking of CCTV footage. You can see it's very professionally made. It's almost like they had a full production studio. This is not the work of hacktivists. This is somebody that is has a professional organization of video developers, of production, and is able to put this together. So you can see that they've actually taken CCTV footage from across Israel and compiled it into this video meant to scare people. I'm going to move on to the next one. This is from last week. I don't know if this one might be newer to people, but...
Hello.
שלום. איתן אלירן?
לא. כן.
זאת רק תחילת ההרפתיקה. אתם התחלתם את ההרפתיקה הזו, אבל סוף הסיפור איתנו. תסבלו נזקים בלתי הפיך בתחום הסייבר והתשתיות. מעתה תשלמו את המחיר עבור כל דם שנשפך. חכו להתקפות משולבות בשעות הקרובות. המתחה ברורה, מוגדרת ומדויקת.
הנה אלה, תראה מה עכשיו. בוא'נה, אנשים פה השתגעו.
Here now they're going through their list of targets and claiming that they've had victory, which is a common theme with some of these groups to overestimate the things that they've done. And then it switches to English. And I'm terrified of synthetic attacks, I'll tell you that. So, you know, in closing, I think there's 5 things that as I talk to customers and I talk to people all over the globe that I tell them. The first thing, that you need to secure your enterprise. You need to do security well. You need to invest in security. One of the biggest game changers we've seen in the last year or so has been implementing things like zero trust and strong identity management. Organizations that are being targeted in data extortion, lock and leak. The commonality is that data is being weaponized today, and that you need to protect that data. You can't just protect the computers or the operating systems or the enterprise in that way. The second thing is that threat hunting is absolutely critical. We see that there's something around 98 minutes from the time that a threat actor makes access to a system to they move laterally, they escalate privileges, they dump credentials. So you have to engage them as soon as they make access, and threat hunting is the way that you do this. The third thing is that legacy antivirus is dead. We can't rely on signature-based antivirus. It's absolutely imperative to use technology, next-gen AV, that uses machine learning and artificial intelligence that can classify something as good or bad without ever having seen it before. The fourth thing is to practice, and this is one that I think gets overlooked by a lot of organizations. You're gonna play like you practice. And if you don't practice and you hit with a data extortion, a ransomware, you're gonna fall on your face. It's not where you wanna be when you start responding to an incident. So go through tabletop exercises and on a monthly or quarterly basis say what would happen if this attack occurred today. We saw the latest attack. Let's kind of do it in the conference room and see what this might look like. And finally, intelligence is absolutely critical. You need to have an informed view of threat activity, how they operate, what they're after, because if you don't know what they're coming after, you don't know what they're doing, then you have not a fighting chance to defend against it. You're reliant on luck at that point. And with that, I think my 13 minutes is up. I managed to just get it in. So thank you very much. Toda rabah.
Great, thank you. Adam, so maybe one question to ask you, and thank you for so much for the slides and the video and your talk. I can also state how important for management is to practice before, and how it looks totally different when organization or top management already thought about these questions and not face them for the first time. I want to ask you, I think one of the most attractive slides that I saw people taking picture of, it was your map of global threats. So if I'm a government, so of course this map can be very useful, but if I'm an enterprise or like a mid-sized company, what can I do with this so important information when I try to include it as part of the way I want to defend my business?
Yeah, I get that question a lot from customers and prospects that, oh, who cares if it's China or it's somebody in Russia or it's some criminal? Well, their tactics vary, their techniques vary, and your defense needs to be varied to respond to that. So if your biggest threat is going to be ransomware, then you might go through a different series of things. I said threat hunting was absolutely critical to a strong defense. So if you don't know what you're looking for, it's really hard to do accurate threat hunting. And from a business perspective, and I think this is often overlooked, you need to understand if China is coming to steal intellectual property. We're here in the startup capital of the world, right? And the cutting edge technology, they want to steal that. So organizations need to understand what is the threat that they need to defend against. Is it Iran trying to come do a lock and leak and embarrass them? That might be more relevant for the government or military. With a high-tech company, perhaps it's more concerned about intellectual property.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, pleasure to have you. Thank you. So we are for the third speaker in our session, and we see the importance and the unique perspective that the global companies that involve in cybersecurity and in this business have. And I think in that sense, we had the pleasure to hear CrowdStrike, and it will be also super relevant to hear our speaker from Microsoft. We have here John Lambert, the distinguished engineer and VP that leads the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. So this is our pleasure to have you with us, John. Please, the stage is yours.
All right, good afternoon. My name is John Lambert. I run the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. This is my first Cyber Week, so come say hi afterwards. Today I'm going to talk about lessons from the war in Ukraine so far. What these lessons and observations come from is Microsoft has been doing a threat intel airlift to Ukraine. We've had actionable information. We want to put it in the hands of defenders so they can do something about the cyber attacks that are happening to them. You heard a lot this morning about partnership, about private sector, the importance of collaboration across the critical infrastructure, private sector, government on cyber attacks. I would say from what we've seen here so far, it's absolutely right. While of course government and military networks are experiencing cyber attacks in Ukraine, in the over 100 actionable tips that we've delivered to organizations in Ukraine, so over 20 sectors have been targeted by the activity in the war so far. Many of them private sector companies where there may not be a CISO, there may not even be IT security, there's just IT at these companies. At Microsoft, the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, we track nation-state threat actors. These are a number that we attribute to Russia. When we name an actor at Microsoft, we'll give them a name from the periodic table. So we'll talk about Astrontium, Adam's team at CrowdStrike, we'll call them Fancy Bear. Nobelium is another one that we've talked about a lot in the last year. They were the hackers behind SolarWinds. Many of the actors that we track have a global remit. They're going after, defense, military, intelligence, diplomatic targets around the world. But there's also actors on this slide that have a very local or regional focus. Actinium, the Ukrainian government has attributed them to the FSB 18th Center. They're based in Crimea and they have a mission. Their mission is Ukraine. There's another one on here we haven't promoted yet to an element called Dev 586 you see on the right. They're linked to the GRU and they're active in some of the attacks that I'll talk about later. And they don't have a global remit, but they focus heavily on Ukraine now, but also border countries with Russia. If you want to know which of these groups have been active in Ukraine, all of them. At the beginning of the war, people were confused. At least there was a lot of commentary that was confused. They were thinking like, where is the big cyber? We expected a NotPetya. We thought the power grid would get wiped. We don't understand what's happening here. And what I would say is the way that I contextualize what's happened so far in the war is you can kind of divide it into three phases. The first phase was in January. We were doing our work tracking these groups and also looking at the kind of TTPs and techniques that they use and seeing, can we see any evidence of those TTPs in Ukraine? And that's what led us to be the first company to find the wiper attacks in January that we called Whispergate. In a way, it was very modest in scale. It affected 6 organizations, most in the government, one IT maker called Kitsoft I'll talk about later. But it was in concert, these destructive wiper attacks were in concert with DDoSs, defacements of government websites, and then massive leaks of citizen PII, like gigabytes of data about personal details of citizens that are leaked onto the internet. That wave was all about intimidation, psychological operations, motivating that all coordinated together. And then after the Olympics with the invasion, we saw a much bigger destructive wave of attacks affecting almost 20 organizations. There are hundreds and hundreds of systems wiped, heavily focused on government and the banking sector there. And then in March and April, things changed a lot. suddenly the cyber operations got increasingly tactical, very focused on specific military movements and attacks that we saw that Russia was conducting in Ukraine. And so like I said, people were confused. Where is the big cyber? Why did they not destroy the power grid at the beginning? And I think the easiest explanation is that Russia believed their war plans. They thought in 10 days they would be governing the country, the government would fall, and they didn't want to wreck the infrastructure of the country. That did not go according to plan, and so they had to adapt. So what I'll talk about in the rest of the time here is 3 lessons that we've seen so far from attack and 3 so far from defense. Okay, starting with attack. So one is that groups in Russia are known for doing supply chain attacks. Better than malware is having credentials, better than credentials is having trust. And if you have supply chain trust, obviously that is a great vector. We've heard, of course, we're all familiar with NotPetya, Nobelium, the hacker behind SolarWinds. They've also gone after cloud service providers, which are a set of companies that help you operate Office 365 or Azure, but they often have administrative rights to your tenant. Nobelium has targeted those as well. Dev 586 was also linked to an attack on Kitsoft, which is a Ukrainian IT maker, and they make government websites that deal with motor vehicle insurance. So it has a huge amount of citizen PII as part of that, and they were behind the attack on that, and other local IT providers there and in regional countries. And I would say part of the way that Dev 586 seems to operate is similar to this, is what I would say. Imagine there's a target website that you need to get into, like a Ministry of Foreign Affairs website. You go to that website in your browser, you do view source, you look at the HTML behind it, and you say, who made that website? Because often in the infrastructure of government, or websites, it will have the IT company that actually helped them design and build that site in the fingerprints of the HTML, and then they go and target those organizations. Another thing that we saw on the attack side has to do with the TTPs that Russia was using. There's nothing more that makes a reverse engineer in my team happier than lots of custom, unique malware. They love intricate malware with lots of modules and capabilities. And while there was, custom malware used by these groups, a lot of what they used were very generic techniques. I would say the AK-47 of this war in cyber was this toolkit called Impacket. It's a commercially available toolkit. It's all open source. You can download it. It's not malicious. It's just Python classes that wrap Windows functionality, and that's all a hacker needs in order to go do lateral movement, dump credentials, and so forth. So there's really not a lot to signature here. This is just legitimate administrative techniques. The other thing is they used a lot of wipers on these networks, but they were prepared to burn them. So we come up with one here, we'll burn it, we'll come up with another one, and so it almost sort of single use in a way. They also used the Microsoft sysinternal's S-delete utility, and that's not a malicious utility. Again, it's just there to securely delete files, scrub any contents from those files out of Slack space, and they use these kind of utilities in order to do destructive attacks. And then in a war, all resources are on the table and they're mobilized, but it also means that targets, organizations that do stuff that maybe you didn't think would be a target suddenly become a target in a war. Some examples here. This was a website that was a marketplace for metal, and you could buy things like rebar and other kinds of things at it. Why was this targeted? Not totally sure, but if you look at what they make now on their website, they make tank obstacles. We also saw them, Russian groups hack into CCTV cameras. That would permit them to see in the battlefield where their troops may be wanting to go or may be moving and get radar, eyes on the battlefield. We saw them in at least one case target an organization that does personal protective services. So think their bodyguards, they protect VIPs in their movements, physical security, and they targeted their IT systems. And we've seen them repeatedly target companies that have electronic billboards that they operate in Ukraine. And in at least one case, after they took control of a town or a city, they used those billboards to display propaganda. So let me go through some lessons on the defense side. So we had actionable information. We knew we had to get it in the hands of organizations that could do something about it. We did build trusted relationships with government officials in Ukraine, and were able to pass them the kinds of attacks that we were seeing. We also wanted to get it in the hands of the end organizations, because even though government may be effective at distributing information to some sets of organizations, like I mentioned, there's over 20 sectors were affected in this war, including people in TV, media, and other companies that may not be super connected to the government from a public-private partnership perspective. So we use local and regional contacts in order to make contact with these organizations and get this information in the right hands. And if you would have asked me, how often, you have 100 tips in 3 months that you're going to go deliver, how often are you going to be able to get that, from Seattle, Washington, into the hands of somebody that can do IT in that organization in Ukraine in the middle of a war? I would have said maybe 10 or 15% of the time. The reality is almost 90% of the time we're able to get the information into people's hands, and a lot of it is through these trust networks here. And I would say this information that were passed, it wasn't just like, for us, not just abstract cyber threat information. This is an example of one of the kinds of exchanges that was happening. We're passing the threat intel tipper information. We're asking them if they can verify it. They're like, give me 5 minutes, we'll go check it. We're wanting to know if they're able to intervene and maybe block this threat. And then suddenly at the same time, that organization was hit by a military attack. So simultaneously, while the cyber attack was happening, there was a military operation happening that was shelling that facility. And so we're here, this certainly makes the war real for us on the cyber side to understand the human cost and the human toll that's going on with these things. So that example that I mentioned, that was a cyber attack co-occurring with a military operation. We've seen that over and over again in Ukraine. These are some examples that we documented in our report that talked about cyber activity that was a week, sometimes the day of military movements. And for us, cyber was one of these areas where we potentially would get a window into where attacks might occur. And in a way, this makes a lot of sense, because one of the things I was going to say is that while cyber can create an advantage, it doesn't wear boots. To gain and hold territory, you need troops on the ground. And I did notice when the colonel from 8200 presented, he had his colleagues around him, and cyber units do wear boots, apparently. So, but my point here is that we saw a lot of co-occurrence of cyber and kinetic activity that was happening. And the last lesson from defense that I'll talk about here is, these attackers, they may seem like they have unlimited time and budgets, but the reality is they don't. They're choosing targets. As the course of the war proceeds, they have to make decisions and time investment trade-offs. And the best way to kind of squeeze their budget, if you will, is through IT hygiene. We saw them, they didn't need to bring many 0 days to bear when there were unpatched vulnerabilities in Exchange servers that let them in the front door, or Confluent servers. NetLogon is a component in a Windows network. We saw networks that were unpatched against that. And then that means if the attacker can land in your network, it's one shot and they're domain admin. And so patching vulnerabilities, that definitely makes their life harder. Multi-factor, mitigated access to VPN and other remote access. We had this company RiskIQ that we bought, and it has the ability to scan a network from the outside in and tell you what vulnerabilities are there. We scanned all of the Ukrainian government IP space and provided those, and the Ukrainian government officials worked to start to prioritize to getting all those holes closed. And then networks with EDR technology, like CrowdStrike, like we have at Microsoft, those networks were more resilient. When attacks happened, they had the ability to see which accounts were involved in this attack. Where did the attacker come from? How did they transit through my network? And in some cases, the networks that we saw that had EDR technology were not able to get wiped. Later, they were subject to a DDoS, but that was almost like the consolation prize was we couldn't wipe the network, so instead we did a temporary DDoS against it. So I hope that gives you a sense of the lessons so far that we've seen in Ukraine. It's been amazing to partner and be part of this, but I think there's a lot more that we still have yet to see uncovered. Thank you very much.
John, thank you. And one question to you. I think I think that we hear on many stages in the last few weeks and months discussion about the cyber in Ukraine, etc. And you brought us really your even not explanation, but the exact description of what happened. So this is really great and important to understand. But if we try to generalize this and we see what tremendous information and the way that you have in your organization to analyze and to get to the real what happened and who are the players, whatever. Do you think that you have today enough, I would say, in the level of collaboration, in the level of legal aspects and relations between countries and other things, enough infrastructure that the knowledge and things that you succeed to find out, that you will help that the world will be safer and more, I would say, positive based on the knowledge that you have?
Well, one of the talks earlier talked about a cyber ferry, and one of the wishes that they wanted the ferry to grant was easier burden for coordination. And here, you don't always have the intelligence, right? But when you do have it, you need to make it effective. And I would say all of the work to build those partnerships ahead of time and the massive network that you need in order to get it in the hands of the right people that can do something in time. So it's not just a report after the fact. All of that work is important all the time.
Great. Thank you so much. Happy to have you here. Thank you for coming. Great. So with that, look what a journey we had in this session. We started with a case that two colleagues from UK came here and shared with us. Then we took the snapshot of the global map of threats with an Israeli focus with a colleague that came all the way from Washington, D.C. to share with us. And we have concluded with the snapshot of how things looks from a Microsoft perspective with John that made all the way from Seattle to come here and to share with us. So this is really kind of a great snapshot of 1 hour spending on intelligence. So I thank you so much for being with us on this session, and wish you a great conference. And this is my pleasure to invite the legend host of the stage, Manny Barzilai, to continue. Thank you, Manny.
Thank you. Superstar Dr. Yaniv Harel.
Great.
You are such an amazing speaker and moderator. Thank you so much for being here.